the Essendon Football Club, victims or villains? How did the players of the Essendon Football Club become subject to an international instrument where the final court of appeal for any disputes relating to that instrument was to be had in Switzerland? And secondly, why did the players who had never tested positive for any banned substance, how could they be found to have breached the anti-doping provisions, given there was no smoking gun that said that they had in fact ingested any illegal substances? And while I want you to be thinking about the how and the why of those two questions asked at the outset, more broadly, ask yourself, what does the circumstances surrounding what happened with Essendon tell us about the culture of elite level sport in Australia? And also, you may wish to think to yourself or reflect on the extent to which anti-doping regime that we currently have does in fact achieve the outcomes that it wants to, whether those outcomes are appropriate, and whether some other form of health-based regime focusing on the players' safety and welfare would in fact be something that would be more advantageous to the sport, more advantageous to the people, and would prevent these types of disputes arising in the first place. But essentially, I want to ask those two questions. How and why? How did the players become subject? Why were they ultimately convicted? The how needs to be answered by looking at the timeline of doping in sport. Now, doping in sport has existed from the earliest days of sport. There is historical evidence that the horses in the chariot races of Roman days were in fact given substances to improve their speed. And even more recently, the 1904 Olympic marathon, we know that the winner of that race was given an injection of strychnine partway through the race, which allowed him to then continue and complete the course. But it all came to a head in 1960 in terms of the modern framework. In 1960, a cyclist at the Rome Olympics died. And while there's some dispute about the reasons for that death, there is strong conjecture that his death was caused by the ingestion of substances that were designed to improve performance. And perhaps not surprisingly, given that European influence, it was France and Belgium that were the initial parties in the mid to early 60s who enacted legislation regulating the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sport. And in 1967, the International Olympic Commission established its own medical body, and in 1968, the Summer Olympics of Mexico established anti-doping rules, though at this stage, any testing is quite minimal. So the message was about don't take these substances, but the reality was you're unlikely to be tested for them. In the late 70s, state-sponsored doping by the then East German regime was discovered, and the early 80s led to technical advances which allowed doping to be more easily discovered through regular testing. 1999, the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, was established, and in the 2000 Sydney Olympics, the testing regime went to new levels. while I've skipped over that fairly quickly, you can see that from the 1960s to 2000, 40 years, the processes were all about increasing the regulation of performance-enhancing substances. And it wasn't until 2000 that really the testing regime had been established that could detect the use of these substances. Though, again, there's a lot of evidence around that many an athlete was able to avoid some of the testing regimes that occurred around that time. 2003, the first version of the World Anti-Doping Code. And if you Google World Anti-Doping Code, you could easily come across it in many places. And national Olympic committees, such as the Australian Olympic Commission, agreed to be bound by this code. International Convention Against Doping in Sport was brought into existence in 2005, and Australia ratified that instrument in January 2006. And that's the first critical date. How did the players of the Essendon Football Club become subject? Well, it relates to that 40 plus year development around, we've got problems here, people are dying, as happened in the 1960 Olympics. We send out the message, we then gather the technical ability to test for these drugs. We then get the governments of the world establishing an international convention against doping in sport. Australia ratifies it. So Australia is now subject to that process. But then the question you ask is, how does this then apply to a domestic football league? One of the most domestic sporting competitions in the world. No other country in the world plays it to any extent. Australian rules football. How does it become subject to that? Legislation is then passed by the federal government. They passed the Sports Anti-Doping Act of 2005. And the federal government, under that convention, under that legislation, has a responsibility to implement and promote safe practices around the use of prescribed performance-enhancing substances. And this is the link. The Australian Football League, as does the National Rugby League, as does the tennis authorities, as do the golf authorities, any leading sport relies on some form of government assistance. And so the governments said to you, if you want our assistance to build that stadium, if you want our assistance to promote community level interaction, if you want our assistance through the use of websites, personnel, other resources that can promote your sport, you then need to implement the framework around the performance-enhancing substances. And so that's how, in Australia, the Essendon Football Club and the players of the Essendon Football Club became subject to this regime. Australian government had become subject to it. Australian government provides money to the Australian Football League, and if the Australian Football League wanted to accept that money, it had to comply. As a little aside, because the Australian Football League has also established a policy around illicit drugs. So not just performance-enhancing drugs, but the Australian Football League went that step further and also introduced a policy around illicit drugs. Before I go on to consider the why, how did those players become guilty? I suppose the question you want to think about just how effective it really is. For those who follow sport, Lance Armstrong, just need to Google his name and you'll come across what he did in terms of the use of performance-enhancing substances, and even since the 20 years since the 2000 Olympics, we've seen extensive examples, or a lot of examples, of the use of performance-enhancing substances. So I suppose the question that I just want you to be thinking about in the background is that use of or the use of a punitive measure, is whether that is appropriate, or whether in fact a regime focused on the health and welfare of the player and the safety of the player, a regulated performance enhancing regime, would in fact work better. Okay, now let's go on to consider the Essendon Football Club. And this all occurred in the sort of 2011 to 2014 timeframe. The then coach of Essendon was one of its best ever footballers, James Hird, and he had been appointed along with a high performance coach to the Essendon Football Club. And that high performance coach introduced James Hird to an expert in physiology and sports science. And that person commenced operation with the Essendon Football Club and started a process by which he sought to get an advantage for those players in terms of their recovery based on the use of chemical substances. And those players were injected by those with those substances. The team doctor approached the coach of the Essendon Football Club. They spoke to the sports scientist about the unauthorised use or injection of players, and James Hird emailed and he's confirmed his position. Any supplements given to those players had to be legal, they must not harm the players, and that there must be player consent to those supplements that they were giving. And the supplement they were being given was this product called thymosin. That's thymosin, Thymosin, thymosin. Now, there are various forms of thymosin. Most of them are not illegal, but thymosin beta-4 is illegal. Now, no player ever tested positive for any form of thymosin. And certainly one of the allegations or suggestions is that they may have been injected with legal forms of thymosin. However, the club had its concerns, and in fact, the leadership group within the players raised their concerns, even though they had signed forms consenting to the administration of 4 substances, including thymosin by way of injection. Essendon continued to have its concerns, and in fact, Essendon Football Club self-reported its concerns to the Australian Football League and to the Australian Sports Anti-Doping Authority. The process then began. The players were asked to show why they shouldn't be banned. When they couldn't show that, what are known as infraction notices are then issued, and proceedings are then commenced. Now, the proceedings start at this AFL tribunal, and the AFL said, we are not comfortably satisfied that any player breached the anti-doping code. So just to repeat that, and that's the test, comfortable satisfaction. And the AFL tribunal said that they were not comfortably satisfied that any player had breached the WADA code, that any player had ingested or attempted to ingest a performance-enhancing substance. The matter is then appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And then here we've gone from the domestic level, the AFL tribunal, to the international level, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, an international body established globally, which looks at these matters. And the issue for the Court of Arbitration for Sport is whether they were now comfortably satisfied that, in fact, there had been a prohibited substance supplied to the athletes of the Essendon Football Club. And the legal test that is different here. The AFL tribunal said there are too many links, too many weak links in the chain. The AFL tribunal said we can't be satisfied that thymosin beta-4, the illegal substance, where it was sourced. How do we know that they weren't injected with thymosin alpha, which is a legal supplement? In the absence of any positive drug test, it couldn't be shown that any player had ever been injected with thymosin beta-4. The evidence relied upon by the anti-doping agency was circumstantial at best, related and given by people of very doubtful credibility. And so the AFL tribunal said that there are these weak links in the chain. And because of the AFL tribunal couldn't show that these chemicals had come into the country, that they'd been obtained by the Essendon Football Club, that they'd been put into a vial and injected into the stomach of the Essendon players, there was nothing on which you could find guilt. The Court of Arbitration for Sport, and most importantly, said we don't need to be concerned about weak links in the chain. Our approach, and the key phrase here, is what are the strands in the cable? And they said, the Court of Arbitration for Sport said, you've got various strands in a cable. And not all of those strands are necessarily of the same quality. However, the number of those strands, the way they interlace with each other, intersect with each other, suggests there is enough evidence that there was an attempt to use illegal performance-enhancing substances. And what was some of those key aspects? First of all, the sports scientist that the Essendon Football Club used had previously supplied a prohibited substance to an athlete. Unrelated to the Essendon Football Club, but it had happened in the past. The sports scientist had discussed with the high performance manager the use of blood tests before injections. Now, the importance of that is that the use of blood tests before injections was commonly done when you were injecting with an illegal substance, but not when you were injecting with a legal substance. The players accepted they had received injections. They had signed a consent form indicating that they were being injected with thymosin. The supplements program that had been introduced was designed to aid in repair and recovery of tissue. Thymosin beta-4 would be useful for the repair and recovery of tissue. Thymosin alpha and some of the other forms of thymosin would not have been. The sports scientist had told a journalist that he was using thymosin beta-4, which I should add that he later retracted when the journalist said, was he aware that that was illegal? Also, the program was secretive in nature. The club doctor appeared as though he had been kept out of the loop. The coach had said I'm concerned about the safety of the players. Nothing illegal is to be given to them. The club also had a very successful start to the season. There were also some text messages between the sports scientist and the chemists who were sourcing this product. And the Court of Arbitration for Sport, in a majority decision, note here that I think it was a 2-1 decision. One person wasn't comfortably satisfied. 2 members of that tribunal said, we are comfortably satisfied that the players had used a prohibited substance, thymosin beta-4, and the sanctions should follow. And they received a backdated 2-year suspension. Critical to also finding guilt in those players was that they had received extensive education about the doping programs. None, not one player had decided to use the WADA hotline. None sought to undertake any searches of thymosin. None had brought their concerns to the club doctor. All maintained the secrecy of the program. The players did appeal to the Swiss Federal Tribunal, which was the body you appeal to, but their appeal was dismissed. So what do we learn from the Essendon saga? First of all, the anti-doping test is a stricter form of liability than criminal liability. In the law, the state of Tasmania has to prove beyond reasonable doubt every element of the offence against you. Doesn't have to happen here. It's only to a comfortable satisfaction, and there doesn't need to be any direct evidence of a positive test. They're not bound by rules of evidence. That the doping tribunal can be satisfied by circumstantial evidence which collectively leads to sufficient number and depth and quality of strands in the cable. Now, this case was unique. It was one of the first times in global sport where a full playing list or near full playing list was served with notices under the WADA regime. And the critical thing is doing the team thing is irrelevant. Strict liability prevails. Even though you can empathise with the peer group pressure that these players would have been collectively under to all participate in the program, it didn't matter. You had an individual responsibility to use the WADA hotline, to find out what thymosin was about, to speak to your club doctor, to determine for yourself what was going in to your body. And perhaps the most critical element here was the failure in corporate governance. The growth in the football department, the increasing professionalism of the football department had not been matched by appropriate organisational practices, nor had the club undertaken the necessary background checks on some of the appointments to the club. There was, in essence, a failure of oversight. So just to sum up, before I sum up, for those who have a real interest in the Essendon Football Club or in AFL, or just interested in sporting literature, I thoroughly recommend a book called The Straight Dope by Chip Legrand. Chip and Legrand, Legrand. He wrote an investigative account of what happened with the Essendon Football Club, and it's a superbly written account of what went on, and nearly everyone spoke to him about what was happening at the post. Not everyone, but nearly everyone spoke to him about what was going on in that. So, to sum up, how did the players of the Essendon Football Club become subject to international instrument, and where the final Court of Appeal, the final resolution, was a Swiss court? Well, that ultimately a political decision, a function of democracy in some respects, function of community pressure, that the dangers that we saw that began with 1960 and the death of the cyclist in the Rome Olympics, and the evidence of state-sponsored drug taking in East Germany in the 70s. And of course, you can even think about what went on in more recent times with the Russian Federation, all led to a movement to respond to this. And it was led by, if you like, a community demanding it, the political will to do it at the government level, and then the adoption of those international instruments which are ratified by domestic jurisdictions and then imposed on domestic sports. Why were the players found guilty? Well, there was a comfortable satisfaction that there was enough strands in the cable that they must have been injected with something illegal. If they'd been taking something legal, why was there the secrecy? Why did they keep the matter? Why were they silent in regards to the club doctor? Why did they sign their consent forms and didn't indicate which form of thymosin they were taking? There was that individual responsibility. The title of this paper is Essendon Football Club, or the players of the Essendon Football Club, victims or villains. That's a decision that you'll need to make for yourself, and something I'd encourage you to discuss with your friends. I personally am not convinced that the anti-doping regime that we currently have necessarily is achieving the outcome that it was designed to achieve, and that a better approach is needed. Thank you, and good luck with your study.